to the things in the movie, like knowing... Oh my god! That's so many pretzels! So my cat just knocked over all of my pretzels. Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel. Today's video is a bit more serious. It comes with some trigger warnings in terms of the actual film I'm talking about, so if you are sensitive to certain topics, I will get into that later, what the triggers are. But essentially, I'm talking about the movie Snowtown, or the Snowtown Murders. It is based off of a real life thing that happened, and it's pretty heinous, the thing that happened, as well as they do a great job of depicting some of the things that happened. Obviously, they don't depict everything that happened, but I was particularly drawn to this movie partially because I do listen to true crime. I used to listen to it a lot, but maybe not as much now. But mainly because I think it's really interesting when people make more fictionalized films of real life events, because you can do a literal comparison to them and see what's accurate and what's not, and sort of what they decided to take out and things that they may have added. But I just think, especially with true crime, it's very interesting. I feel like I've seen so many fictionalizations, especially Lifetime. They love to do something crazy, but there's also other ones that I want to talk about in the future. But this was one that I stumbled across, so I thought I would share it. Yeah, it's a lot. So Snowtown is a 2011 film directed by Justin Kurzel, and it's actually his directorial debut, which I think is absolutely amazing because I think that this film looks and feels so real, and everything in it, the sound design, the acting, I mean, I had multiple visceral responses, and not just to the violence, but to the things that were happening because they were just so well made. But of course, this film is based on real life events that happened in Snowtown, Australia. However, a lot of what actually happens, the crimes that were committed, didn't actually happen in Snowtown. It's just where they found bodies. So it has sort of become a part of that town's history, and sort of given them a not so good name. But these crimes happened between 1992 and 1999. So this film was made roughly 12 years after the events, and the perpetrators were apprehended. The film follows a kid named Jamie, who is also based on the real life person named James Spiridon? I don't know how to pronounce people's names. And the story takes place mostly from his perspective. However, the person who was really the main person doing all of these crimes and really getting people to be involved with it, as well as Jamie, is a man named John Bunting. So of course, before I go any further, I'll give you trigger warnings for the movie because I wish someone had kind of told me more of what to expect, because some movies will be about crimes but not really show you anything, and then other ones go into gory detail. So if you are planning to watch the film, it is very much for mature audiences, but I wrote trigger warnings for just any sort of violence. There's SA, and the R word, not just SA, but the R word. There's some nudity, there's full frontal nudity, from I think both men and women. There are some homophobic slurs that are said and written, so if that triggers you, as well as one that I wish that someone had told me because I'm autistic and I have misophonia, is there's a lot of dinner and eating scenes. So if you don't like mouth sounds or eating sounds, would not recommend in that regard. If that is super triggering for you, would not recommend, because they do a lot of it. Also, I just want to make a disclaimer that this is not a full telling of the whole crime. This is not a true crime channel. I'm just telling you, I'm going to tell you about the crimes to give context, because again, knowing about these crimes sort of helps put into context some of what happens in the film. So obviously most of these crimes were committed by John, so I'm going to start with telling you about John just to give context, because again, I feel like this film makes more sense in understanding what happened, like before, like knowing what happened, so that way you can sort of understand like what you're supposed to gather from like what's going on in the film. Because the first time I watched it, all I knew was that it was based on something that really happened. I didn't know all of the details, and so there were a lot of confusing moments in the film that like didn't really have any explanation. They just sort of like would show people, because there are a lot of people in this film. They show people, but I don't know what their relationship is, and I don't really know like what they have to do with anything, but then they end up being like important later, and I'm like, I don't know who that is. So yeah, I will help with giving some context. So when it comes to John, the main perpetrator of these crimes, we have to talk about like his childhood and whatnot. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail, but essentially he was essayed as a kid by like his friend's older brother. And this really shaped how he viewed and understood sexuality, because this essentially led him to hating gay people and also equating them to pedos. For some reason, his hatred seemed to be towards these specific groups of people without making much differentiation. So if you were bisexual, he might be okay with you. But if you were specifically and openly gay, he did not like you. And if he suspected you of being a pedo, he would also like throw gay slurs at you, etc. Like, he really hated people. So after this, it was very clear through like his actions and his like later jobs that he was a very angry person. Like, as a kid, he was mutilating animals, which is like, you know, you hurt animals, you hurt people. But he also sort of got involved in like ism. And he also ended up working at a crematorium, so he was burning the bodies as well as working in a slaughterhouse. And he really loved that job. He loved cutting up these animals and killing them. And even though his actions were very hate-filled, he was considered to be a very nice and charismatic and friendly type of person. He ended up marrying a woman named Veronica Tripp, and they decided to move to Salisbury North in Adelaide, which is in Australia. And when they got married and moved in together, this is also where they met Robert Wagner and Barry Lane. These men are key people in what happens later, as well as a man named Mark Hayden. But he was there. He didn't stop anyone from doing anything, but I guess he was just a very quiet man, so like he was definitely the kind of person who just sort of stood in the background and like... But essentially with these men, John created his own little group of people that, again, he was like influencing with just his charisma and stuff, like a little cult leader or something. And like they really listened to John, but he had all these friends that he would hang out with, and they would pretty much talk about how much they hated pedos. Like, that was their thing. And in 1992, before he'd ever met Jamie, he ended up killing a man named Clinton. And this was simply because Clinton was gay, and he was open about it. And like a lot of serial killers who tend to get away with their crimes for a very long time, he chose a lot of people who didn't have a lot of friends and family support. So when he killed them, they were not missed as much. There were some people who definitely had people who missed them, but for the most part, there wasn't like a huge push from like friends, family, or the community to find these people when they went missing. However, in 1994, he met Elizabeth Harvey, who was Jamie's mom. And this is where the film starts to intersect with like real life and the crimes. So we begin the film with sort of learning about Jamie and his life, and we see his mom is like not quite like in the best of health, both like physically and mentally. Like she seems like a good mom, but like things could be better, you know, like a mom who's just very tired of struggling. He also has two younger brothers that I don't think like we really see much of them, but they do play a role in terms of like sort of showing us that like Jamie is still a kid and he's still interacting with children, so like he very much still has a childhood. So in the movie, Elizabeth is seeing a man named Jeffrey. He like lives across the street, and it seems like he sort of helps out, but maybe is also like kind of in a relationship with her. It's sort of like, again, she has a lot of these relationships that it's hard to like really tell like where they're at, because she also is technically married to a man that I'll talk about in a little bit, but like, yeah, it's very confusing, a lot of the relationships, because they don't really specify, and I know that sometimes that happens in life, but like, yeah. But not long after we sort of set the scene of these, you know, on the lower income side of kids just sort of hanging out in the neighborhood, they've still got like a childhood, they understand sort of, you know, struggle and seeing their mom and stuff, but at the same time, like, everything sort of seems okay. Jeffrey decides to take inappropriate photos of the kids. And a lot of what the film does to juxtapose a lot of the horrendous and like heinous things that happen in the film is to sort of pair them with things that remind you of childhood or remind you of goodness. And they do that a lot with like church scenes, because they go to church and you hear them singing, but they also juxtapose it with the kids riding their bikes and like playing video games and just sort of hanging out like most kids do. So one point where I got like really confused in the movie, because again I couldn't tell who was when they introduced this man who Elizabeth was married to in real life. But this man named Marcus shows up, and he's sort of like, oh, I kind of want to get back together, and Elizabeth kind of doesn't really seem like she wants to. Again, she just seems like physically sort of ill, and like sort of a spoiler, I guess, but like in the movie we don't see this, but at the end, when they're sort of giving like, you know, what happened to everyone, Elizabeth Harvey was like struggling with cancer. I don't know if you could like tell in the film that she was supposed to be struggling with cancer. Like, you know, some people really just are like, they just are like lethargic all the time, so I couldn't tell if that was like part of like, if that was just who she was or what, but he stops by and he's sort of like, I want to get back together, like, I still love you, blah, blah, and we see his son, David, in the background. And again, the only reason I'm mentioning this is because David is an important person later in the story, but just know that, like, he's Jamie's stepbrother. So Elizabeth finds out that Jeffrey took these photos of her children, and she immediately goes over to Jeffrey's house and starts to like wail on him in front of her kids, and the kids are just sort of standing there like watching. Sorry, bud, you're too big. Sorry. But she calls the police, and it seems like the police didn't really do anything, but later that evening they hear a bunch of like motorcycles revving, and when they look outside there's a man on his motorcycle and he's revving right at Jeffrey's door. And the next day we find out that this was actually John. Essentially, John enters the picture and he just starts harassing Jeffrey with his buddies. Like, he and his buddies get together and that is what they have set out to do. And I will say that both the actor and the guy in real life, John, they do kind of have this like sort of like look to them that doesn't immediately read as like deranged serial killer. Like, when you think of somebody who goes out and like kills people, you think of someone who's very scary, but this guy just seems like your regular old like round-faced type of guy, and that's how they like portray him, is just like sort of this normal guy. Nothing really like red flag about him at all. And so they sort of characterize John as this very friendly, very nice person. He tries to like fix up a car with him and his buddies. Like, I want to assume it's like Elizabeth's car or like a car that they have on their property, something of the sort. He gives the boys rides on like his motorcycle, and he just quickly becomes like an integral part of like their lives. Like, he has now like become again like a friend and a mentor to these boys. And the first time that we really see that he's like homophobic or like has a disdain for pedos and gay people, or at least his like equating them is when he decides to get the boys all a bunch of ice cream, and they throw the ice cream at Jeffrey's house and they write the F slur on his window. And later we see sort of his little round table, his group of friends all together with Elizabeth now there, talking about how much they hate pedos and how there's too many in the neighborhood and the police aren't doing anything about it. And we're really starting again to see how this is like manifesting for John. So earlier I mentioned that Barry was an important person to like remember because he sort of is like in the group, but at the same time, John really does not like Barry. He has a lot of disdain towards Barry, and you can sort of see it in this scene, simply because Barry is queer. I'm not really sure like if he was gender fluid or if he was trans before he could really like call himself trans. It's really hard to like know what exactly he went by, because he also sometimes went by the name Vanessa, so I don't know if he was trans and he wasn't able to change his name to be Vanessa. In the Wikipedia page they refer to Vanessa as a she, so something that I noticed upon my second rewatch, and also just going into like more of what happened in the actual crimes, it seems like they don't really delve much into the actual violence or the violent nature of John. Like, you get little hints of it, and I don't know if that's because we are seeing things more through Jamie's perspective and maybe he didn't witness as much violence as John really did sort of do, but just from like what I understand, John was actually kind of a very violent person. He just had this sort of friendly facade. Like, it's very eerie to think about. And one sort of hint of this that we see in the film at sort of the beginning, and maybe this is sort of considered like the first time that Jamie really is like witnessing this sort of like almost violent or vengeant sort of nature about John, like to a much like larger extent, is when John is sort of cutting up deer. And like, as someone who understands like deer hunting for the most part, like, it's not weird for someone to cut up a deer, like to prepare it to have the meat to eat and like, you know, like dry and stuff. But what John ends up doing is taking some of the body parts and putting them in a bucket, and he has Jamie kind of smash it into a sludge to throw on Jeffrey's like house. And yeah, for one, that's gross. I don't know if that actually happened, but this seems like our first sort of test, I guess, of Jamie within the film. However, it's mostly known that when John was first testing Jamie, this is not what he was doing, because this is a very clear like retaliation to someone that did something that was objectively not okay, whereas in real life it seemed like a lot of John's tests to Jamie were to take neighborhood animals and have him mutilate them. And that is just like, again, that seems more telling of John's nature than something that feels not justified, but like at least like there's a clear connection as to why you would like do that. We also end up seeing there's a scene where Jamie gets R-worded by his half-brother Troy. So I mentioned earlier that he has a step-brother named David. This is another brother, it's his half-brother, named Troy. Troy seems like he's slightly older, like maybe closer to like his 20s, mid-20s, so, but in real life this did actually happen. He was sexually assaulted by his half-brother, as well as he was also, and his brothers were also sexually assaulted by their birth father. And I don't know if they're like separating that from the man named Jeffrey, or if Jeffrey is supposed to be a different person. Again, it's like very confusing, some of like what they stayed with, like the facts versus like sort of what they added, because there's not really any like mention of a Jeffrey in here, mainly because later Jeffrey ends up moving away. Like in this film, he ends up moving away. So like he was not a victim of John's. However, I think in the film after this scene, it's very clear Jamie wanting to find connection and wanting to find a like male figure that seems strong and seems like a good person to him. And so I think he becomes a little more integrated into John's social group, as well as I think this is probably like a little bit of the catalyst for his like desire to be a part of that group, especially because of their hatred towards gay people and that such thing, even though being gay does not make you SA people and so on and so forth, right? But essentially, John and his friends had gathered around to make a list of pedos they were essentially going to go after. And of course, Barry is included in this, as he is telling the names and he's giving information, but John clearly has a disdain for Barry, and there is sort of a breaking point for him. But after this, we sort of see that Jamie wants to stay over at John's house, and it seems like he just sort of wants to get away from everything, so John lets him stay, and Jamie sees on the wall sort of this like web of things, you know, with all the yarn and whatnot, and at the center is Barry. And in the grand scheme of things, you may think to yourself, like, oh, of course Barry's the center. He is the one giving all of the names of the people to go after. But at the same time, knowing that John has a disdain for Barry, there are some other connections that can be made as well. And this is where we actually see John's first test of Jamie. So again, this is something that they changed from real life. But in the film, John prompts Jamie to kill his dog. Kill John's dog, not Jamie's. And obviously this dog has done nothing wrong. She seems like a sweetheart. And Jamie's like, why would I do that, essentially? Really? No. No. Goodbye. But yeah, the dog has done nothing wrong, and Jamie feels kind of uncomfortable at first, but he knows that it's a test, and thus he shoots the dog. And within the film, John sort of makes it a point as like, I know that you were sexually assaulted, at least like by your birth father, and so like you need to take that power back. Like you need to not be, you know, the shy kid that everyone walks all over. Like you need to be strong, and to do that you have to shoot my dog, which is like, again, a weird way of that. Like I'd never understand why people don't just go after the people who like hurt them, why they have to go after innocent people. That's just really weird. So next in the film we meet Ray. He is another victim of John's. He was technically the second victim, but I think in the movie it's like the first person that we sort of have an understanding that they want to go after. Apparently this man is accused of like flashing children and like touching himself in front of them and whatnot. In the film, they sort of characterize him a little bit differently than I think he was in real life. So, it seems that Ray in real life may have been intellectually disabled. He also lived in like sort of the backyard trailer of this woman named Suzanne, and in real life, Suzanne is the one who was accusing him of doing these things, whereas in the film, Suzanne doesn't really seem to care. We also see her naked for some reason. I don't know if that's to show like the weird depravity or like the weird power that John has over people, but like she strips for him and it's really weird. But like, go her. What a queen. At least like in terms of the actress, like queen. So after this, we sort of get like shots of a bathroom with blood on the walls, and it's implied that this would be Ray's blood. We also hear an answering machine like recording of Ray pretty much saying like, oh, I'm not coming back, I'm going somewhere, etc. And this was also something that they did in real life, which is John would record his victims saying like a goodbye message on their answering machine. So, like, to sort of throw people off and to, you know, keep people from asking questions. Another important plot point is after Jamie gets home from a movie with his, I think, brothers or family, John decides to show him the bodies in the barrels. And that's sort of like what is most well known about the real life case, is that there were bodies in barrels. John shows him the body of Gavin, who was a friend of Jamie's. This friend was a junkie, but otherwise he was like innocent. Like he didn't do anything wrong. It's just that he was addicted to drugs, and John didn't like that. He also sort of offers to show him the body of Barry. And both of these people were real people that were killed by John, so like that is true. So in this film, they actually don't show like all of the murders that happened, because obviously they don't show the first one, but they also don't like show really what happens to Barry other than that he was killed by John. Either way, Jamie's clearly upset because that was his friend, and it's heartbreaking for him. He's crying, but it's one of those things where John's like, get over it. Like, take a deep breath, let's continue on. Then we get the scene where they kill Troy, the half-brother who had essayed Jamie earlier in the film. This one, again, is another one that happened in real life. It was, I think, one of the first ones that Jamie was, like, really involved with, which makes sense because, like, he was the victim. However, in the film, they sort of show it, or, like, characterize it as more of him, like, sort of watching as John is taking this sort of revenge for him, and only sort of, like, as they are torturing him and about to kill him, that, like, Jamie truly gets involved and, like, actually, like, finishes the job. They do torture him. It is gross. They do sort of reference real things that happened. They did a lot more heinous things to some of their other victims, but they don't show any of that. This is the only scene where we really see any sort of torture, and I think it kind of makes sense because it is directly related to Jamie. Next, we see Jamie go to the doctor, and he gets medication for schizophrenia, and he does it under the name Fred, and this will actually be one of their next targets. Fred was accused of touching young girls, and so they went after Fred, as well as they end up befriending a man named Gary, who is mentally and physically disabled. Again, he hadn't done anything wrong. Like, Gary wasn't even accused of anything. I really think that John was just losing his mind and was just going after anyone at that point. Like, he was just off the deep end. There's also a great scene where they're, like, showing Gary, and he's feeding his snake, and he's feeding, like, a rat to his snake. And, like, obviously, like, snakes sort of just, like, gobble things whole and stuff, but it's such a great, like the imagery there of, like, sort of Jamie watching as this snake is, like, eating it whole, eating its prey, and very much, like, in relationship to what's going on. I'm surprised that they didn't have any, like spider related things, because that was sort of a thing with John, but again, this movie's about Jamie, so I can understand why they wouldn't have any imagery of, like, spiders and stuff, but needless to say. Either way, at this point, Jamie is fully integrated in the group. He is fully helping John kill people, and he, like, the actor who plays him very much has, like, a blank sort of face, so it's hard to tell if he's, like, reluctant, if he's really into it. Like, it's very hard to read him, which I think is actually a great choice because, like, again, I just don't have the information to know, like, what Jamie could have been thinking in real life. But towards the end of the film, one of the men who was helping, his name is Mark, like I said before, he is just kind of this quiet guy. He says that his wife, essentially, like, he accidentally told his wife what was going on, and, like, at first they sort of laugh, but it's very clear by the way that John is laughing that, they're going to kill Mark as well as his wife. So there's also a couple scenes that kind of confused me. One of them was one where John is, like, watching, Jamie's little brother, like, wear this sort of dress, and he's just standing in front of him, and then he gives him 2 bricks to, like, hold up. I don't know if that was punishment for something, or if he was just being weird. They go swimming, and, like, John and the little brother are the only ones who go into the water to play. as well as he also shaves the kid's head, and I don't know if that's like an indication that like John is trying to also take his little brother under his wing or what. I don't know what that's hinting at. If you guys have seen the film and have an idea, definitely let me know down below because I'm dumb. Anyway, we're pretty much at the end of the movie. John takes Jamie and the guys to the old vault that they end up using. It's like outside of town, and this is where they will begin storing bodies in barrels. This is also where they will be committing their crimes, so they won't be burying people or, you know, keeping stuff on their property like they were before. They now have a dedicated space to it. In these last few scenes, this is also where Jamie convinces his stepbrother David, like I was talking about before. He convinces him to come out to this place. He tells him that like there's a computer there, and he essentially just lures him out to the vault space where it's clear that all of, like, he shows up and he's confused, and all of the men looking at him like something is not right, and we see Jamie close the vault door, and that's the end of the movie. And of course, because this was like based on true events, they sort of give us a rundown of like what happened afterwards, of how they, like, you know, caught the guys, put him in jail. Jamie did, you know, a lot of speaking and testifying against John. And interestingly enough, and I think this is probably why people are talking about this again, or maybe why this seems like it's become a popular subject at the moment, I don't know, but I saw some stuff online of people sort of talking about this. But essentially, there's a possibility that Jamie could be let out next year, as in 2025, which is like crazy to me, but also like, I don't know, again, it really depends on like what his role was in this, because he was just a kid when he was like essentially groomed into this position, which is like kind of ironic because, like, you know, when you think of grooming, you think of like for like a predator to do that or a pedo to do that, and that's exactly what John was doing, but for murder. So, but again, the movie was made extremely well. I especially think that because it was told from like more of Jamie's perspective, that they had more leeway to sort of, again, use those scenes to juxtapose a lot of the awful things that were happening between John and everyone. I think if it had been told more from like John's perspective, it would have been a very dark film. But I do think we would have gotten to see probably all 11 of the people. I think maybe they had 12 victims. Yeah, there were 12 victims, but he was only charged with 11 because they couldn't find one lady, Suzanne, who had like disappeared, but they just didn't have enough evidence to like actually like charge him on that. However, I do think that he doesn't have parole, but yeah, I do think it is a really good like adaptation of the events. Again, I don't know if I'd be like, oh, I highly recommend this film, everyone should watch it, because again, there's just like so much going on with it, and I do think that you should know a little bit about the actual things that happened before going into it, so it gives you a little more context, especially, like I said, there's just a lot of characters that don't get any explanation, and like, I understand that's how real life is. Like, in real life, people, they exist in your life, and like, if someone were to jump into my life right now, they wouldn't know who like anybody is, so like, I get it, but at the same time, like, give me something, you know, like, give me just a little bit so I can understand who these people are without the context, because again, if you watch this with no context, it is going to be a little confusing, but very well made. So, props to this being Justin Kurzel's like directorial debut, because he did really well. But yeah, that's all that I have for this week, and I will see you guys in the next one.